How are we doing? Okay.
Okay, you good, John? Can you hear us okay?
I can.
Excellent. Okay.
Well, welcome, John and Christine. I'm Tom Schroeder. I'm the president of the NDLA this year. I'm going to welcome you and all of your family and your classmates who are all online joining us for this happy occasion. My understanding is that everybody except for John and Christine should be muted, but if others are on the video and they're not muted, you probably ought to mute just to make sure that we can all hear each other.
And Tom, I think there's about 30 people that have joined.
Okay.
So it's really neat.
That's great.
Mhm.
This is fantastic.
Turn
So
it down.
we have the privilege of bestowing an award to one of our law school graduates, John Lancaster, who's dedicated not just his career, but his life to making the world a better place. One of John's fellow classmates at the law school was none other than Patty O'Hara, Dean and Professor Emerita, and Patty's going to give a few remarks in just a moment. The award to be presented today is named after Father William Lewers. He's a longtime and outstanding faculty member of the law school who also directed the law school's Center for Civil and Human Rights. And the award recognizes a Notre Dame lawyer who has devoted outstanding service in the area of civil and human rights, or who has worked for social justice. So Tammy has arranged to have the award sent to John there in New York. And so I hope you have it there with you, John.
Do.
All right, great. So let me just, what I'd like to do at this point in time then is present the award to you and read the proclamation, the citation. So John, on behalf of the more than 13,000 members of the Notre Dame Law Association, I'm pleased to honor you with the Father William Lewers Award. And the citation reads as follows, and it's quite lengthy. It says, whereas the Father William Lewers Award is awarded to Notre Dame lawyers who have made outstanding contributions in the area of civil and human rights or social justice. Whereas for more than 4 decades, John Lancaster's work on disability policy in the United States improved the dignity and quality of life for persons with disabilities. John Lancaster's work was integral to the transformation of America to be more accessible, available, and open to the handicapped. Whereas John Lancaster graduated from the University of Notre Dame in 1967, was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps, served in combat in Vietnam, was severely wounded in an effort to rescue a wounded Marine, and was awarded the Purple Heart and Bronze Star. Whereas John Lancaster received his Juris Doctorate from the University of Notre Dame in 1974 and dedicated his life to the service of people with disabilities. Whereas John Lancaster drafted and helped implement Maryland state laws protecting the legal rights for people with disabilities. Whereas John Lancaster was instrumental in drafting and advocating the Americans with Disabilities Act while serving in both the President Clinton and President Bush White Houses. Whereas John Lancaster served on U.S. delegations to Vietnam and subsequently joined the Vietnam Assistance for the Handicapped organization in Vietnam, spent 5 years working in support of Vietnamese war veterans and civilians, and assisted the Vietnamese government in passing a Disabilities Act modeled after the Americans with Disabilities Act. Whereas John Lancaster served in leadership positions, or as a board director for Humanity and Inclusion, U.S. and International, the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities, and the United States International Council on Disabilities. Whereas John Lancaster was appointed by President Obama to the board of directors in the U.S. Institute for Peace. Whereas John Lancaster served as Chief Executive Officer and Executive Chairman of the National Council for Independent Living, which is the oldest grassroots organization run by and for people with disabilities. Whereas John Lancaster's story reminds us that some of our most committed peacemakers are war fighters, and that he has lived in Notre Dame's values of God, country, and Notre Dame. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Notre Dame Law Association proudly presents the Father William Lewers Award to John Lancaster in recognition and appreciation of his distinguished service to the United States, his contributions to people with disabilities worldwide, and his life's reflection of Notre Dame values. Presented this the 24th day of March, 2023 at Notre Dame, Indiana. Signed G. Marcus Cole, Joseph Matson, Dean and Professor of Law, and me as President of the Notre Dame Law Association. And accompanying it is a plaque, which John hopefully now has as well. There it is. And it reads, the Notre Dame Law Association proudly presents the Father William Lewis Award to John A. Lancaster in recognition and appreciation of his distinguished service to the United States, his contributions to people with disabilities worldwide, and his life's reflection of Notre Dame values. So if you, at our tables here, John, everybody has a glass of champagne, and I would ask everybody to raise your glass. Let me grab mine real quick. And a toast to John Lancaster. Congratulations.
Here.
Are we still connected?
Yes, they're still connected. The noise is drowning out the.
Yeah.
So it's a great pleasure now to introduce Patty O'Hara, Professor and Dean Emerita, who's going to say a few words, and then we'll hear John after that. Patty.
John, it's wonderful to see you after so many years, and it's really a privilege to be able to offer some remarks on this joyous occasion in the presence of your family and friends, and in the presence of the Notre Dame Law Association Board of Directors. The NDLA Board does great things for the law school. They help us on admissions, and it's not a coincidence that they're here on Admitted Students Day, and they help us with placement, and they have taken a lead role with respect to public interest that really was the progenitor for our loan forgiveness program. But they also make awards, and they have a lot of awards to give that have distinctive things associated with them, because we need these to be exemplars for our students. And I'm going to say that with one notable exception, which is they had the poor judgment to give me an award. Their track record is impeccable for aligning the award and making it a perfect match for the recipient. And that's true with the Father Bill Lewers Award. And so most of my remarks are going to be about you, but I wanted to say just a few words about Father Bill Lewers so that you can see the parallels between his life and yours. And I just have to picture Father Bill up in heaven. He loved the Cubs, and when the Cubs were winning and all was right with the world, he would sit and do a little circular motion like this, and that's how I visualize him today, pleased as punch that you are the recipient of his award. He was an Illinois law grad who was raised Scotch Presbyterian. And he converted after law school. And like you, John, once he was animated about something, he was all in. And so he not just converted, he became a priest. And he was actually on the law school faculty when we were students, but I know I didn't know him well. And I don't think many students did, because he was in London our first year. And then he came back and he taught fairly specialized courses. And then in our third year, he left to become provincial of Holy Cross for the Indiana province, which was a misnomer because it included everything west of the Mississippi, Bangladesh, Chile, and East Africa. And like I have heard as to your practice and advocacy skills, he's very strategic. And one of the first things he did as provincial with his law degree was that he had the province incorporate their most important ministry in Chile because he could see Pinochet coming down the line, incorporated as a Delaware corporation. And when in fact Pinochet tried to expropriate St. George's, he sent Father Hesburgh and a New York lawyer down to explain to Pinochet that should he expropriate St. George's, they would never see another dollar of US investment because it would be in the headlines of the New York Times. And Pinochet did not expropriate it. They took over operational control, but they never took legal title. And later in his life, in the last decade of his life, he made a trip down to Chile and secreted out documents related to Holy Cross and Pinochet physically on his body that we have in the repository of the law library today. When he came back, and this is when I came to know him, he returned to the law school faculty for the last decade of his life. And it was then that he formed the Center for Civil, Father Hesburgh had formed the Center for Civil and Human Rights. He expanded it just like you began domestically and then expanded internationally to the Center for International and Human Rights. And again, strategically, when he was terminal with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and knew that the Ford Foundation grant that funded it was going to run out, he went to see Father Malloy and he squeezed Father Malloy, the officers and the trustees to make sure that the center would continue until it was endowed, which only happened within the last several years by our colleague Jen Mason-McAward here at the law school. So I think that you can see the parallels, but one of my best stories is I always asked him, what made you convert after law school at Illinois? And he said, I converted because I believed in the Catholic social justice teaching. And then once I converted, I found out I was the only one who did. I think he would be exceptionally pleased to see that you as the recipient. And the proclamation says with a lot of whereas, all of your achievements, but it's sort of like our CVs. I like to hear the person's story a little more personally. So I'm just going to hit the highlights. Everybody knows that you were a 67 undergrad. They may not know you had a naval ROTC scholarship and that you asked to be commissioned within the Marines. And so you were a second lieutenant at graduation. And it was only after about 6 months more training that you landed at Da Nang Airport in Saigon in January of 1968, and 10 days later found yourself the commander of a platoon, 32 in size, all of them mostly 18-year-olds and you 23. And it was only 5 months after that in the firefight, when you heard one of your men calling out for help, that you crossed over and engaged in a hand-to-hand combat in which you were shot, both of your lungs punctured by the bullet and your spine shattered with respect to that. I've read articles, John, in which when you reflect on that day, consistent with the way you lived the rest of your life, you don't comment on your own loss. You talk about the fact that 18 of the 32 were injured, 4 were killed, and that you especially were concerned about the young man that only had a week left on his tour with a wife and 2 children at home, and you had tried to protect in the rear. You went through almost 2 to 3 years of hospitalization before you came to the law school in 71, and I'm going to circle back to those days. But when you graduated in 74, you went to work for the Veteran Administration Appeals Office because it was the only place that you were able to get a job offer. And you processed veterans' claims for benefits and appeals with respect to that until you were approached and began your life of advocacy working for a not-for-profit Paralyzed Veterans of America, and then worked with the governor of Maryland in passing important state bills that were sort of the progenitors for the ADA, so that when the ADA was passed in 1990 in the tenure of George H.W. Bush, you joined and within a year became the executive director of the President's Committee under Bill Clinton for the implementation of the ABA with a particular focus on employment, going all over the country to educate and bring together really for the first time employers, industry, government officials to help them understand the requirements and why it was in their best interest to implement the provisions of the ADA. I find that chapter of your life in the mid-90s when you chose to go back to Vietnam to be pretty incredible. And that happened because a Vietnamese American came to your office and asked you whether you'd be willing to help. And to help Vietnamese veterans was mostly to help North Vietnamese veterans. And you did that for 5 years, becoming close friends with a person that you described as being another disabled person that had adapted a motorcycle to put a third seat on the back in which you could sit. And you never were together and served at the same time in that bloodiest of the Tet offensives. But you went back and dedicated 5 years to trying to bring to Vietnam the same things that were happening in the United States. So it's no wonder after that expansion of your work into the international arena that you were asked to serve on the board of the U.S. Institute for Peace. And in 2012, he testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for the ratification of the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And John was one of the people that helped persuade the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to advance the ratification of the Senate floor, but it did not pass the Senate. And to my knowledge, it has not yet been ratified today by the United States, but not for lack of effort on the part of John. And in his last position, he served many years as executive director of the National Council on Independent Living, which was the oldest grassroots organization for the disabled. But I want to circle back to John's law school years because I was privileged to be his classmate. And so you'll be happy to know, John, that I was not able to get your file from the archives.
Yeah, good.
We present as a member of the class of 74, it's obviously a source of great pride to present this award, but I think really the emotion that we should be expressing is one of thanks. Because characteristic not just of Notre Dame, but of higher education, of government, of industry, of everything in our society. If you think back to 1971, you know that John came to the law school at a time that it was completely inaccessible. John, when he testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said, while there was certainly tension around the politics of the Vietnam War when I returned, it was the inaccessibility of my environment that made me feel least welcome. I returned to a country not ready to receive me as a man who now used a wheelchair. And John, you cited examples of buildings that are inaccessible, of buses, of all the means of transportation, railroads, vans that had not yet been adapted. But you also cited your admissions interview at Notre Dame, where, and this isn't unique to Notre Dame, I think it would have happened at virtually any law school in the country. The key question was, how will you get into the building? Because think about this, we were in 1971, we were in the original 1930 building, which means that there were steps, no ramp to get to the inside the door. And then there were more steps inside the door, as there still are today, but with accessibility, to get to the first floor. There were 3 classrooms on the first floor. There was no bathroom on the first floor. The bathroom and the student lounge were in the basement. The law library was on the 2nd floor. There was no elevator in the building. And John's answer in the interview was, I'll get into the building then the same way that I got into the building today for this interview. Prepared him for a question that he received or the whole time that he was looking for a job coming out of law school. Compare that original 1930 building, and it went through a renovation at the time we were in law school, but one that only moved sort of the law library out a little bit, nothing that really addressed a lot of the accessibility questions, to the 2 buildings that we enjoy today, which are accessible in every possible way, not just because they go through a review of the building committee and the unit, but because they go to the Board of Trustees, where when ours went through, Shirley Ryan was serving on the Board of Trustees, and while they had been done to specifications, she had them broaden all of the corridors in the law school. And so just like society, we learned that when you make those kinds of modifications, it's for the comfort of everyone, not just for the disabled. But more importantly than just the physical modifications, it opens us up for students, faculty, and staff that are so gifted and who enrich us by their presence. So John, the class of 74 has many successful members. We've got judges, we've got people who are managing partners, but I think it's safe to say that there's nobody we would be more proud of than you. So thank you for the breadth of your heart, the acuity of your mind, the courage and strength that allows us to claim you as a graduate when you were asked how you get into the building. So I know if I asked Father Bill now, why did you convert? It would be because he said, I believe in Catholic social justice teaching, and thank God I'm not the only one who does.
We lost Pat.
John, the floor is yours, sir.
All righty. Well, thank you very much, Tom and Pat. Pat just went over a lot of the things I was actually going to talk about, but I want to take this opportunity to make some acknowledgements and to drive home a point that Pat was trying to make about my career, and I think the career of a heck of a lot of other people who graduated from that law school. And Pat, you were a way better student than I was, and I'm sure glad you couldn't find transcripts of when I was there. And as but I want to thank Tammy Raster, who works with the law school and is herself a graduate of the law school, Charlie Weiss from the board, Dean Cole, Tom Schroeder, and Pat, and all those involved in giving me this great award. I really want to acknowledge First Sergeant James Barnett, who's on this call someplace, and I want to thank him and James Barnett's wife, Ann, who they've been supporting me ever since I graduated from Notre Dame, and my good wife, Christine. I want to thank Pat Finneran. Jim Barnett and Pat put me up for this award. I can't help but acknowledge Mike and Kathy Crow, who are here with me. Mike and I were classmates together at Notre Dame undergrad and overlapped in the law school. Mike's brother, John, who unfortunately is no longer with us, his brother, Dick, who lived with me throughout my law school and helped me keep going. Tom and Pat McMahon, dear friends who, again, helped me make it through law school. And some of my classmates from way back then, like Pat, Jack and Vivian Fitzmaurice, Clark and Karen Arrington, other friends, John and Jackie Goldrick, all people who were my support network when I was probably spending a little too much time in Sweeney's and not enough time in the law library. But I made it through, and a tremendous family, some of who are on this call, my brother Leon and his partner Lynn Fielder, and my dear sister Mary and her husband Eddie, and all the wonderful nieces and nephews and grandnephews. One of them's here behind me, Gary Kiersey, who's going to go to Notre Dame someday and play lacrosse, and my mom and dad. I wish they were here to see this. My dad himself was a graduate of Notre Dame undergrad and law school, graduating in 1940. So I guess it runs in the family somewhat. And then the biggest support system that's helped me accomplish a lot of what I have, my dear wife, Christine, sitting right next to me. So, and there are many, many more people that I should be acknowledging, and I, and I feel awful if I'm leaving out key people, but family, cousins have always all been there for me. And when I returned from Vietnam, as Pat said, the world looked very different to me. And it was intimidating. I felt discriminated against in a very systematic way, maybe not intentionally, maybe not like hateful discrimination like maybe African Americans have experienced or other groups, but nonetheless, a very intimidating discrimination when you can't get on a city bus and your taxes are helping pay for that bus and you can't get on it, you start getting a little cranky. When you can't get up courthouse steps, especially if you're an attorney, you start getting a little cranky. And so there were a number of things that I was facing. But when I first came back from Vietnam, I went back to Notre Dame and actually enrolled in the graduate school and was working on a PhD in philosophy. And after a year of trying to relate Martin Heidegger and phenomenology to John Dewey's functional psychology and pragmatism to make progressive education more relevant to classroom pedagogy, I figured I better get my head out of the clouds and see how I can make some money. So I applied late to the law school. Actually, I was over a month past the deadline. And I remember my interview.
Good one.
And Pat related one of the stories, but the other was when I was pleading my case to, at that time, the Dean Lawless and Associate Dean Fascio and Professor Murphy, who taught contracts and uniform code, the Uniform Commercial Code and other things. And I'm sure some of the old timers remember them. And I'll never forget, Les Fascio finally said, and I could tell he didn't want me in the law school, didn't think it would work. And he finally said, pleading also to Professor Murphy and to Dean Lawless and me, you don't understand, John, we've filled the complete class for this year. You applied late. Frankly, your LSATs are okay, but your grade point average from undergrad, well, and, you know, and he was hemming and hawing like that. You just don't understand. We literally don't have a seat left. And I just looked at him and I said, Dean Fascio, don't worry about it. I'll bring my own. And at that point, Judge Dean Lawless, he had been a judge in Buffalo and happened to be a friend of my dad. That didn't hurt. And he said, accepted. So I got into the law school. And frankly, I didn't do well my first year and wasn't taking it seriously and had a lot of problems academically, and they flunked me out. And that was going to be it. And then a professor who I rarely agreed with about anything, although I admit he was a great professor, but his politics weren't exactly mine. But he had been a Marine and he was a great man, and I got along with him fabulously. I had him for constitutional law twice. And Professor Charlie Rice. And I think, again, some of the old timers would remember him, God rest his soul. He passed away not all that long ago. And he was a great Marine and a great man and a great attorney and a super professor. And he got me back in. And thank God he did, because that Notre Dame law degree has enabled me to do so many wonderful things. And I've had great mentors along the way, Jim May, Judy Heumann, who dragged me into the disability rights movement, Larry Roffey, who's on this call someplace, who was one of my bosses at the Paralyzed Veterans of America, and kind of cut me loose and let me work on some of the initial things that we did up on the Hill around making mass transit accessible and around getting involved in starting a movement. I ran into some wonderful people at the Philadelphia, at the PILCOP, the Philadelphia Law Center. Anyways, they were a public interest law center in Philadelphia, and they were suing at the time SEPTA for accessible buses. And then Larry and I got into working with others that were suing WMATA because of the new subway system that they were building in Washington, D.C. And when they went to open the first 4 stations of the subway system on the Red Line, in fact, it was the first 4 stations in the entire system, we actually got an injunction with the help of a law firm to flat out stop all construction until they made, as Congress had told them to, those stations accessible to people with disabilities. Well, that had them scrambling, as they had to hold up the opening of the system for 6 months until they got elevators in. So those 4 still don't work that well, by the way. But I must say I had some wonderful other opportunities that Pat referred to, the opportunity to work for Governor Harry Hughes of Maryland. And then I met Jim Raggio and Larry Raffy's wives, Kathy Raggio and Maggie Raffy, who were working in Maryland, doing great things on the deinstitutionalization of people with intellectual disabilities and mental health disabilities. And I got in on that work with them, and they're two of my heroes. And through that work, we were able to really have an influence on Governor Hughes, and he jumped all in with us, and we were able to start a major movement in the state of Maryland that echoed really around the country, because while it had been going on in certain other states, we were the ones that really started doing it systematically, institution by institution, and getting the people out, getting them into the community back home with families with the right type of supports, or actually in group homes or something that was much more akin to a real life. And we did other things. We got all the polling places accessible to people with disabilities. We started getting the state buildings and facilities accessible. We did a lot of other good work. We worked hard on employment issues to get people with disabilities into jobs and working. And then that kind of morphed into working for 2 fabulous people, 2 of my mentors, Justin Dart as chairman of the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities in the Bush administration, Bush 1, and then with Tony Coelho, who was the chairman of the committee at that time, in the Clinton administration. And I got to be the executive director of a small agency, the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities. And actually, Tony and I and a couple other key people who were on the staff, the best thing we did for the employment of people with disabilities in that position was to kill the agency. And we got the president to go along with us. We got an executive order written to actually do away with the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities and to start instead an assistant secretaryship in the Department of Labor, called the Office of Disability Employment and Policy, where they would have some real staff, some real money, and could do some real programming. So I said to Tony, you want me to be the executive director of this President's Committee when it can't even begin to make a difference? How are we going to do that? We have a $1.2 million budget. There's tens of millions of people with disabilities who aren't working. And he says, well, the first thing we do, John, is build up the agency, have a couple worthwhile programs. Then we kill it and move it into the Department of Labor with real staff and with real money. So we did that, and things started to happen. That great opportunity I had to work with Vietnam came about as working for a man, Chan Van Ka, and his nephew over there, Bui Van Tuan, and the differences we were able to achieve over there are truly remarkable, and fortunately go on today. What was even better is I got to know and work with people with disabilities themselves in Vietnam and to help them build the equivalent of a rights movement within the context of their system. That is holding together today and continuing to make a difference. So I've had some blessed opportunities, but some of the finest came towards the end of my career, even part of it after I was retired, and that's working with great people at Humanity and Inclusion, and again at the United States Institute of Peace. And George Moose, who was chairperson of the United States Institute of Peace, he followed Steve Hadley, and just the honor to work with those people and other great people on that board to hopefully try to make a difference in this world and to keep armed conflict at bay, to have people talking instead of shooting, and whether it's in Africa or whether it's in big country policy, they got a tough one to work on now. I have finally rotated off the board, but it was a tremendous honor to be involved in the efforts that USIP continues to put forward, and the work that Humanity and Inclusion does in the world to remove landmines and unexploded ordnance, to do inclusive education for people with disabilities in countries all over the world. So I've had some remarkable opportunities. I have been blessed in my career. I have worked under some tremendous mentors. I've mentioned a few of them, but I'll tell you, none of these opportunities to make a positive difference in the world would have been available without what I learned during law school and my time at the Notre Dame Law School. That degree, that Notre Dame law degree, opened a ton of doors for me. And having that on my resume, having them know from whence I came, that it just provided opportunities to make a difference that few people ever get. This is a wonderful recognition of my efforts to live up to what our law schools are all about, producing and being a different kind of lawyer, a Notre Dame lawyer. So thank you very much for this honor. And I hope I didn't talk too long, but I am proud that I'm a graduate of this fine institution and am affiliated with all of you. So enjoy your lunch and go Irish.
John, congratulations again on behalf of all of us. Thank you for your service to the nation, not only as a U.S. Marine, but your service to the nation for all of those with disabilities, and your service to all of us, because your work really is a contribution to the country as a whole. I can tell you during Patty's remarks, there wasn't a dry eye in the house at the end of her remarks. So you make us proud to be able to say that we are Notre Dame lawyers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. And again, thanks to Charlie Weiss and Tammy Raster for all your fine coordination and communication around this award. Much appreciated.
All right, what's next on our agenda? We have a break.